Welcome students to the online NPTEL course Contemporary Architecture and Design. We started discussing about the postmodernist architectural movements. So today we will discuss another postmodernist architectural movement, which is critical regionalism. This architectural movement has a reaction. This is a manifestation of a reaction against modernist movement, which is internationalism. So in internationalism was about international style, which will be followed everywhere, and a particular visual style which is previously set visual style, which can be designed in any context, and the overpowering use of steel and glass and a particular color which was set from before has to dominate. But in critical regionalism, the main idea was it has to respond to the context of the surrounding, and it has to blend the design element, and it has to take the design element from the nature of the space or the culture of the surrounding into the design. So in this time frame, so this is actually not a time frame, so all these postmodernist movements started coming mostly parallelly with each other. So this is a critical regionalist movement where we have seen how these movements were reacted with the modernism. Historicism did not acknowledge modernism. It went past. High tech changed the modernism, so as the new modern, it was changed the modernist movement. High tech changed a different style of modern phase of modernism. New modern changed a different phase of modernism. Critical regionalism is a reaction against the modernism. This is absolutely opposite of one of the particular style, which is international style of modernism. So this is a design which falls under the critical regionalist movement. It's designed by Geoffrey Vava of Sri Lanka. He's a Sri Lankan architect, and his designs are emerge from the Southern Indian and Sri Lankan style of design, from Chettinad Style of architecture, which is a traditional architectural style of a southern part of India and Sri Lanka, and then also the local climatic context and the local design elements were amalgamated within the design. So this design, which looks like it emerged from this particular place. So you cannot take this building anywhere and put the building. It will not go with the context. So it is designed for that particular site only, which is opposite to the internationalist movement. Internationalist building can fit into any different places. So the architectural features are against the placelessness of internationalist movement. So internationalist movement does not have a place. So there's a particular visual style. Style is dominating over place. So there was a fixed style that these are the colors: white, black, gray. Has to be used, and then you can use the main three primary color. The main steel and glass has to be the main element, and then it should have an anti-gravity look. It should be cuboidal. All this previously set visual design parameters was there in the internationalist movement, but this was devoid of a place. So anywhere you put the design, it will be like that. So as the Seagram building was again the same of though it is in front of the sea, it is the same, and then Francois Thousand Johnson House also has a similar kind of design palette. So it was against that movement of international movement of modern architecture. Now critical regionalism has a sense of place, which is opposite to this, and meaningful placemaking and contextuality. So what is there in the context, that will be inferred from the context, and that will be reflected into the design. So the regional, cultural and spatial significance of the design is there. So there's a factor of the place, and there's a factor of the time, because what time it is. So there's regional, cultural, people's behavior, and this spatio-temporal elements which is there of this particular contextual spatio-temporal elements will be reflected into the design. Now, critical regionalism is not just regionalism. Regionalism is a vernacular, so it's not a vernacular architecture. So it will take the vernacular architecture as a mood board and the visual board, and then it will change the vernacular architecture into the context of postmodern architecture. So that is why the time factor is coming. It's not a replica of the vernacular or the aboriginal or the rural architecture or the traditional architecture. It's not just a traditional or vernacular architecture and replica in today's time. It was a contextual change. There will be a contextual change, and it will be fit within the context of today, but the inspiration will be taken from the vernacular, as well as it might not take the inspiration of vernacular or tradition. It might take the inspiration of the local surrounding or the nature of that particular design as well. So the time specific, it is time specific, it is a contemporary vernacular. So vernacular will be changed into the contemporary. That's one aspect of critical regionalism. The consciously time specific, at the same time consciously denying the universal visual vocabulary of internationalist approach. So it's a time bound factor, because this is denying the internationalist style which was going just before that, but it was also taking the spatial factor into the thing. So the local context is coming as a spatial factor, and the time bound context is coming as a temporal factor. So these two spatio-temporal factor is changing the vernacular design into a contemporary vernacular design. So this contemporary part is there. That's why it's not a replica. It will be changed according to the today's need of behavior and people's need of a function within a building. So the experience of a building is, it's a bottom-up approach of design, which is postmodernist or user-centric, or there's an emotion of people will be added within the design. It's not devoid of people's perception and people's behavior like the internationalist movement. So there's an emotional attachment will be there, because if you are putting the local elements or the natural surroundings into the design, so there will be a connect with the users, with the people. That was the concept of postmodernist approach. So there was no previously set design parameter, and designers are imposing that into the built environment, and so there will be design which comes from the people's behavior, people's culture, and also the nature will be amalgamated within the design. So that's a process of bottom-up approach. Top-down approach is when there's a theory and that comes as a design, but bottom-up approach is there's observation and then the design. So what happens in top-down approach? So there will be a previous theory, like international, like most of the modernist approaches, the top-down approach. So there's a previously set theory that this has to be like this. That was there in the internationalist movement. So there was a set design palette, set design color, and there was a set design principle. So that theory came first, and then based on the theory, the designs are coming on the a particular side. So what the theory says, and that will be the manifestation of the design will be from there. But in critical regionalism, what is happening? So there was no theory, so it will be the only thing is it will respond to the context. So first they will not architects will not start with a particular visual style. They will look at what is the local visual style, what is the people's behavior, what kind of elements are there, and those will create the visual palette. So there was no previously set visual palette and visual design. So from these contexts and what all these elements will create the design, and then the final design will come. So there's a bottom-up approach of design. There's a difference between top-down and bottom-up approach of design. So architectural features, the terminology first generated by Alexander Tonis and Liane Lafreville. They are saying this critical regionalism need not directly draw from the context. So rather, elements can be stripped of the context but used in unfamiliar ways. Here the aim is to make evident a disruption and loss of place that is already accomplished fact, though reflection and self-evaluation is there. So what they are saying is, in this bottom up approach, so they will see the elements from the context. So suppose there is a element, these elements are there already there in the context, which will be collected from there. So a few of the elements which is more dominant is collected and sorted here, and but it won't be directly added there. So elements can be stripped of the context, and it can be changed into their own way. So there can be a fusion, and then it can change in a different way, and then it can be translated. So it's not a direct thing. There can be disruption, then it can be in an unfamiliar way of designing, but there will be a contextual connection. It will come from there, but it's not a direct manifestation. It can change. With other examples, we'll see what Lafrave and Tonis is saying when we look at the examples. Now here, if we look at the example which is designed by Christopher Charles Benenzer, who practices in India, and his design into Center for Development Studies and Activities in Pune. So if you look at, so this was the element which was there in the visual mood board, which is the hill, local hill, and its color is gray, and sometimes this local hill, if you look from closer, it has this brown color. So this is the Pune's hill, which has a stone color is like that. So when he is designing this, he is using the texture, the stones texture, which matches with that, and the roof texture, which also matches with the hill. So he is taking the inspiration from hill, but he is not making a hill. It's a building, and which has a similarity with the hill. So it's local. It's taking the context, it's stripping away the elements from the context and putting it in a different way, but visually some connection. It can be a visual connection, it can be a conceptual connection, and functional and behavioral connection, but this connection is there. So this design is set for that particular backdrop. Now these hills, if you look at, so there's irregular lines. So and the roof line is also irregular, different lines are there to match with the natural setup of the hill. And then this connection where you can see this from here, you can see the setting sun. So it has a particular angle, and this is giving the particular vista towards the hill. So these connections and the lines and axis is coming from the particular setup of this design. But it's not a exact thing what is there in the surrounding. It is changed, and a totally different paradigm of design is evolved from this context. So another theoretician, Kenneth Frampton, explains the critical regionalism in his write-up. So critical regionalism, as explained by architectural historian and theorist Kenneth Frampton, in Towards a Critical Regionalism, 6 Point of Architecture of Resistance, he talks about how to become modern and to return to sources, how to revive an old it's talking about dormant civilization and take part in the universal civilization. That's this is written by Paul Ricoeur in History of Truth. He is taking the inspiration from is quoting Paul Ricoeur, and then he is coming to the 6th point of architecture. We'll discuss that how he is describing critical regionalism from his point of view. So he is telling adoption of contemporary style critically, which is the process of critical regionalism. His universal progressive qualities, which is time, plus values driven from the geographical context of neighborhood, which is space. If we blend together, then it will be a critical regionalism. So it's not just a special factor is there. So there is a temporal factor, which is the contemporary. So it's a universal progressive qualities which is there in the contemporary architecture. That's why it is part of the contemporary architecture. It's not vernacular architecture. And then values, the concepts and the philosophy and the visual and then people's behavior or the natural surrounding will be taken from the geographical context. So geographical context includes the nature, also includes the people who live in that surrounding and their cultural and social behavior, and everything which comes from a spatial context. So there is a spatial and temporal, both the context has to be there in the critical regionalist style. Now Kenneth Frampton in his 6th point of architecture style of resistance talks about these points, which these are the chapters, so you can read his write-up. So these are the paragraphs heading, and then gradually together with the 6 headings he has he's talking about critical regionalism. What is critical regionalism? What is the meaning of critical regionalism into today's context? So in the first paragraph he is talking about the culture and the civilization, how the culture and civilization started forming, and then rise and fall of avant-garde, which is is part of the modern movement. So modern Art Deco and Art Nouveau, how they have started a radical movement, which is because avant-garde style was very radical, and it has a particular set of norms, and there were many avant-garde movements. Stichel is part of it, and then there was a rise, but it collapsed. Why it collapsed, according to him, is because it did not take people's voice. It was a radical, it was a top-down thing, design style. There was a radical visual style, and that was there, and we did not have any social contextual element into the design. Now in the next stage he is talking about the critical regionalism and the world culture, how critical regionalism started flourishing in the world culture from the postmodern era. So modern era, and the resistance of the place form. So there was when these two things started, then the built environment and the in this stanza he is talking about the built spaces in the urban form started changing, because there was a modern, and then modern buildings were there, then the postmodern buildings are there, and especially this place form, which is the public design, started changing, and then people's voice, like place making. So this is not a space, this is a place. So space is becoming a place, which that is becoming the form of a form of a city, which is creating a mental form or mental image of a city, which is coming from the Kevin Lynch this 5 elements of imageability, like this plaza elements, the nodes, which creates an impact of the visual in the mental frame of a mental model of a particular urban form. And so these when these places are as we know, space plus activity equal to place. So when it can be a particular 3D space, when you add people's activity, so people's layer is added into the space, then it becomes a place, is a memorable space. People remind that place, like a particular there's a connection within the memory of the people, like Connaught Place is a place, so it's not just a space. People remember that place in Delhi, so that has a vibrant activity going on, there's a particular characteristics, that becomes a place. So there's a people's activity, and this people centric design is part of the change what he was talking about. Then the culture versus nature. So it's not culture on side and nature, so culture and nature both impacts the placemaking in the urban design, and or in a much macro level. planning level, but this also impacts in the in a critical regionalism way. This also impacts in a building level, and the things which are impacting is topography, what kind of land topography the contours are, the context, and this context is also people's context and this their sociocultural behavior and their particular way of thinking, and the climate and light, and the tectonic form, which is the which is not topography. With the tectonic, what is the material of this particular stone or earth, like the tectonic form was taken as an inspiration in Christopher Charles Benizer's this design in Pune. The visual and tactile, so it's not visual, it's also the tactile, like for example the stone is gives a tactile form, like grass, use of grass, stone and different materials gives it's not just a visual, it's also tactile. Or the haptics or the sense of touch will also evoke this contextual connection. Now, one of the example of critical regionalism is this church by John Hudson. John Hudson also designed one particular of this Sydney Opera House in Sydney, which also sets in the particular settings, which is near the water body. It's like a flower or this like a lotus or like a sailing a boat. So that's also connecting the context. So John Hudson's, if you look at this design time frame, it's quite before. So when the critical regionalist approach was coming up, even Kenneth Frampton's write-up, if you read the write-up in the 6 point of architectural resistance, he have used this example of John Hudson's design to conceptualize the to write the critical regionalism. So this started the critical regionalism in the design. Now, if you look at, so this kind of design taking from the nature was not it is not critical regionalism is not just the first, because if you look at the prairie architecture and organic architecture, they have responded to the surrounding as well, but that did not carry it forward in the high modern or the internationalist movement. That stopped, and then different movements started coming. So critical regionalism also in that way has a similarity with the prairie architecture and organic architecture, which talks about the connection within the from the nature, and architecture should evolve from the local context. Now, this town hall in Finland, which is designed by Alvaro Aalto, who's one of the famous critical regionalist architect, it has a connection, comes under the this particular movement. Now, if you look at, so this is a entry of this town hall, and this is a tactile connection from the nature to this inside of the building. So there's a fluid amalgamation between the outside to inside. When you step on this grass land, which is if you look at, so this is a grass, and it's under the natural surrounding, and all this coniferous trees are there. Now when you start entering the building, it's also the nature is coming with you. So it's not just one particular line from outside, this is nature, and then inside this is a man-made. So there's a free transition between the nature to the building. So these grass are giving a tactile context of nature, which is coming within the built form. Now, this, if you look at the building, so this is exposed brick, and a lot of wooden work is used in the building, which is giving an earthy look with the which also connects with the nature. So these are the color which connects with the nature, not the pure primary colors. This green, brown, these are the tints. These are called the earthy tints, which connects the nature more strongly with the blends the nature with the building. Now, this is if we look at the plan of the building, which comes from this traditional European court and tower model, so of a civic center. So this is a town hall which is a civic center. The traditional European civic center has a court, so there is a court and you enter towards the courtyard, and then there is a tower. So these are the traditional model of civic center which he followed, and the traditional material wood and brick is giving this design. So that's how this is blending the concept of traditional court and tower model of a civic center into the design, and becoming a example of a critical regionalist design. Now this is another example which is in India, which is designed by famous architect Charles Correa in 1920, which is Cidade de Goa. This is the design. This is a hotel in Goa, and which is taking inspiration from a Portuguese colony of Goa. So these are the Portuguese colonies photographed from Goa. So if you look at the Portuguese colony, this is making a street facade. Street facade are the facade when different buildings or different buildings of different people, different property of building are joined together and then creating a creating a linear joined facade. So these are the different people's building, they are joined and their treatment is different, but they have a visual simile. What are the visual simile? So they have a white border on top. This kind of line is going from different floors, but there's a dissimilarity because each and every people they have a different color. So this dissimilarity is also there and similarity is there. So here also there's a one side there's a circular, and sometimes it's also can be rectilinear, but the thing is there has to be a border which is white border which goes and which is there in the Portuguese colony. So here I've taken this in the and changed it into a more modern way. So this circular and ornamentations on top of this are deleted and became more modern, and this white border is coming in everywhere in the design. And also there's a to break the monotony, there was different people's buildings are different. So to break the monotony, he is not following this particular street facade, and he's just changing the breaking the monotony with the solid and void. So there was a monotony was breaked here by the color. He's breaking the monotony with the solid and void, but there was also a break with the color, but more or less the similar color palette was used with some accentuation, darker color tone, and sometimes this blue which also is used in the Portuguese colony, and most of these colors are taken from this Portuguese colony's building. So these colors are quite similar and taken directly from the Portuguese colony. Similarly, within the gate also, this is just a painting which is how the Portuguese traditional doors and with the guards are there. So this is just a painting and this is not a door, this is just a wall treatment is there. That's why this is a postmodern thing. So these elements of designs are also added into that, and thus gives a connection with the Portuguese colony into the design of this hotel. Now another design of Charles Correa's Jawahar Kala Kendra in Jaipur. It's designed in 1991. So the concept of Jawahar Kala Kendra's plan was evolved from the Jaipur's city plan, which is designed by Vidyadhar, the architect of the city planner of the Jaipur. So there was one side, there was a river. So this coming from a 9 squares are creating the Jaipur's plan, but because of this river, 1 square is added on the other side, and this is coming from a concept of Navagraha, which also he have Charles Correa have used. So one side when it's people enter, one cube which is part of the Navagraha is removed and shifted here to make a courtyard through which they can enter the building. So this which is also done in the Jaipur city plan. So from one side Jaipur's have shifted one cube, and he have shifted this to make a gateway to the design, and all this Navagraha 9 grahas are there in the design. So this also has a concept of the traditional Indian culture, and if you look at these graha signs are there in the design, and the center is the sun. And then the style of this design, if you look at, so all these elements, the jali works are taken from the Jaipur, so Rajasthani style of design, and all these broken works is also walls which is coming from outside, gives a sensation of the fortress of Rajasthan. And the sandstone cladding also has a connection with the Jaipur's color palette, the pink sandstone. And but if you look at this jalis and doors, these are not ornate like the typical Jaipur's door, or like this. These kind of doors, it's very modernized and just a rectangular door, but and also the jalis of jharokhas are changed into a more modern, which is a cuboidal elements. But still you can see the connection from this, how this elements of Jaipur's are translated into a more modern concept of design. There's another example of Charles Correa in Kolkata. So this is a city center of Kolkata, and the Kolkata's context of tram, and the Kolkata's context of this street. So these are the if you look at this traditional street shopping, these are the traditional ways of shopping. But the shopping mall generally has a atrium, and around that it will be a glass box. That is the general concept of shopping mall, but he have not designed that. So these are the trees, and so these are actually the black street floorings, which looks like a street, and you get a ambience of a street shopping into the shopping mall. And also if you look at the plan, this kund, which is designed on the center, takes if this is the kund, which is near this cross section of the road, so people can come from this, and that is also coming as a concept of a place making from postmodernist approach of urban design. So this is if this is the road, and this part is given for the people, and people can come and sit. So there is no shops over here, and people can just sit and then talk to each other. That's also a culture of from the locality, where people love to talk to each other. And then this part, which is given to the place of urban realm, is creating the place of memorable place in this shopping mall. Then another famous architect of critical regionalism was Tada Wando. Is from Japan. So his philosophy are coming from the Buddhist principle of Zen philosophy. So when he's taking the inspiration from a Buddhist philosophy, which is Buddhism is followed in Japan, so then he's connecting the building with the locality, because that is the principle which is followed in that particular area. So that is how it can also be a philosophical connection, which is coming from that particular context. So context can be of anything which is dominant on the particular area. So from this Buddhist Zen philosophy, he's taking the minimalism and social reform and the way of living as a particular concept, and the emptiness of the spiritualism and serenity. And this emptiness, to show this emptiness, he will connect this, he connects the nature with the with the building, and this spiritualism and the serenity comes through the natural elements, bringing the sunlight or the other natural elements like water into the design. And then solid and void, which is a positive negative thing of yin and yang, is also part of his design philosophy, which is all coming from the Buddhist principle and the philosophy. So this is Kishono House by Tada Wando. This here also, if you look at, so this is a rectilinear building, and this rectilinear building is not this rectilinearity is not coming from internationalism. This rectilinearity is coming from the Buddhist philosophy of minimalism, which is a local concept, and then and that's how it becomes a critical regionalist. He becomes a critical regionalist architect. And then the solid and void. If you look at this building, the solid and then the entrance is void, and then solid and again void is created in this design. And then in his design also, if you look at the tectonic plane, or this terrains are blended with the with his design, and his design is following the terrain, land and the contour of this design. Now the lights lights play a very predominant role in Tada Wando's work. So light has a lot of emphasis in his design. So the way he's taking the light outside light, that becomes a design elements, and in this space creation of space, light plays a very important role in the design. So these patterns on the floor and the wall is created by the on the roof are created by the light he is taking from outside, and all these little lights are natural lights, and these are not artificial lights. The sunlights are creating the pattern within the design. So this is charge of light, which is designed by Tada Wando again, and this is a charge, and if you look at the charge, so this cross, which is in the charge, we will look at the cross or the Jesus, is not a cross. This is just a void in the design, and from outside the light is creating the pattern, which is the cross. So here from outside the light is creating the cross, and so nature is blending with the design, and that is what this is he's taking nature, the natural context into the design, and that is creating the light in the design. So there was an example which was designed by John Hudson, that is also of the similar concept. So this design I did not discuss this in detail. This is also a church in Copenhagen. So what John from outside, this is a rectilinear building. So you will see from, if you look at the exterior building, so this will be this. So this is the sectional model. So within this building, so these kind of elements are created in this building. So this is again, so double roof is created. So this is not a minimalist approach, and then these roofs which has a void within that. So you are seeing this roof, which is the section, gives a sensation of the cloud. So this is the sketch by conceptual sketch of this. So these are the clouds are translated into the roof pattern of this inside of this charge, and through this cloud sometimes this sunlight comes through this cloud. That's what he tried to create in this charge. So this sunlight will come through the cloud, and this is dependent on the nature. So when the sun will come, then only the sunlight will come from this his design, and this is taking the natural element, which is sun and the sunlight, into the design, and that is playing a role in the design in his design. So this sunlight which he is taking from outside is taking the natural element into the design. That's why it becomes a critical regionalist building. Similarly, in the Church of Light, he is doing the same thing, and this is also, if you look at, this is a very minimalist building. Tada Wando is a minimalist architect, but he's a postmodernist architect, because he takes the inspiration, he takes the design element from outside into the design, into his design. So also, if you look at, so this building is just like this two elements are there, and this and also from the other sides there this natural sunlights are coming and playing a pivotal role in the design. This is Church of Water. Again, he is taking a natural element into the design. So the water which was there in the natural setup, he placed the church, the cross, in the water. So you look at the natural setting. So natural setting becomes a part of this wall in the design. So this part, which is the main facade, and people will look at that part, is the nature. So they will look at the nature, and his design, which is the main element, is the church cross, is on the natural element, which is the water. So he's blending the nature into the design and into his design. So the nature is fusing with the with his design. That's why it becomes a critical regionalist building, where he's taking his blending the context into the keeping the context in the design. So it's again the water temple. If you look at this water is a man-made water, and this water's color could have been the blue tiles, which is the predominantly what we see. So from the building, this is on top of the building. So if you see, if you come from within and you have to take this staircase, and then you have to turn back, then people will turn back and look at this pond. It's not a it does not give a look and feel of a man-made water body. It looks like a pond because of this plants which is there within this water, and this color of this water which blends with the nature of the natural surroundings. So if you look at, so this is amidst of a dense vegetation, and the similar color palette is blended on top with the design. So this because of this water temple, this is creating a natural this is blending with the nature, and all these curves and all is flowing, this terrain contour land is flowing through the building, and this is encompassing the building, and this looks like this building is designed for this particular setup. And also if you look at, so this comes from a curvilinear line, and then again a pure geometric thing. So this is coming from natural random lines to a particular circle. So this is fusing with the nature. Now again, this is an art museum by again Tada Wando. So all these lines, and then this particular water has a connection with this water which is on the outside of this site, and this roof garden is helping the design to blend with the natural surrounding. Now all these natural elements are also within the design, but with the Tada Wando style of rectilinear pure design and geometry, which is his style, is also followed. Now if you look at the roof of this building, so all this natural tectonic surrounding, and then the natural contours are maintained, and with the punctuations of very geometric style, which is Tada Wando style, but the natural context was retained as much as possible in the design. And also this axis and are created to visually frame the natural surroundings. And this is another example, Awaji Amibutha International Conference Center by Tada Wando. Here within the building you will see the geometry and geometric elements which is creating the design. But from outside, so this is the terrain land. So the buildings are within this roof garden, but the roof garden, if you look at, so these are the square which is coming from his minimalist approach of design. So square is the pure form, but this squares all together, and the square is again divided with another square together, creating our continuity has a continuity with the terrain landform. So the landform, which is the natural landform, is not disrupted with a built form which is on top of it. You will see a amalgamation and a blend with the landform, because the same kind of colors are retained, and each and every top of this square has a different colors, so that to blend with the natural variance of different colors of trees foliage, and this blends with the nature. But within that building, if you look at Awaji Amibutha, again this waters and lights will come within the building, and the way Tada Wando uses the natural light is also there in the building. This is another example of by Mario Botta, is another famous architect in the critical regionalism style. This is Casa Bianchi in Switzerland. So this design is evolved from this particular setup. So the design is like generally we enter the building from bottom and then go up. In this building, it is like we enter at the top and then go down. The functionality of the building is changed according to the local context, and all in this building, there's this through this bridge you enter on the top level of the building and you start going down, and this is set on the terrain of this particular terrain. And if you go in, so if you have a clear vista of the terrain which is visible from this side, and throughout each and every floor, you can have different vistas from this beautiful terrain of valley of this design. So the design functionality is evolved from this particular context, and also the design is dependent on that. So these long slits are to create uninterrupted vista of this particular building. And this building, if you look at the plan, these details are available on net. So this has a lot of layers and elements added on top of each other, so that you get a clear punctuation, and a lot of punctuations are there. So it's layers on after layers are added, and then you see from different angles you will see, look at this, you will have a vista of this valley from different angle, and that is derived from a particular context of this site. Now Mario Botta has other designs which evolve from a particular design style. So his design style, he mainly uses pure forms of circle, square, and a lot of bilateral symmetry will be there in his design. So that is his style, and all these lines, this brick and in stone and in concrete, he will use these lines. These are lines which comes from a horizontals picture frames, and this kind of textures he uses is brick and concrete, which is gray and brown in this tone, which also blends with the natural surrounding. His another design, it's a hotel and spa in Switzerland. So if you look clearly what is the concept of this design, so this hotel and spa is here under this which blends with the terrain of this Switzerland's snow-cladded terrain land, and all these elements, these trusses are giving a natural look of this terrain, which is not a straight line. So all these bricks are there. So actual spa and hotel is in you don't see the actual spa and hotel. So the main visual focal point is the skylights of this spa and hotel. And if you look carefully, the skylight which blends with the coniferous trees around the buildings, or even the color of the skylight is the gray color, which is the color of this coniferous trees on the high altitude. And the position of these skylights are also quite different in this concept. These are the visual inspiration and his design of the skylights. And if you look at the skylights also, there's a difference in the skylights. So some of the skylights has these kind of design, and some of the skylights are like this. So because in the natural setting the trees are different, so to break the monotony, he created this different skylights, and they are positioned in different spaces. And these lines which is there in the skylight creates the visual line of this blends with the coniferous trees visual line. And within that there are some skylights which also takes the natural light, and which is also suitable for this extreme harsh climate, so that the sunlight comes, and through greenhouse effect some heat will be there. And also you have a visual connection from the outside, and through the big skylight also you can see the outside, and there's a visual blend from nature to the to the built form. And as I was talking about, Mario Botta has this kind of lines in his design, which is his design style, and he plays with the pure geometric form. This is a truncated cylinder, and these are cuboid, and these circular punctures are also Mario Botta's style of design, and these straight lines are also there in the two of his other designs. Now coming to the Indian context, Sabarmati Ashram, Ahmedabad, Charles Correa, we have discussed this in the neo-brutalist design, because that was the later phase of modernism. So some of the examples which can be in the later phases of modernism, which was going towards postmodernism, which is from in between modern and postmodern, and also can come in the critical regionalist movement. Many of the examples which we have discussed, like Louis Kahn's Dhaka Assembly, is also can be considered as a critical regionalist building as well, because it takes the bamboo texture in the skylight, and then also it blends with the river and the moat around the fort, and the translates the fort and also the arches into a modern context. So that's also a critical regionalist building. Now here in the Sabarmati Ashram we can see this is a very it's not a rigid plan, so it's going in a different direction, in a very organic or free flowing way. So it gives a way of a village, like village clusters are there, and this comes from a village hut, and all these tiles and local vernacular elements are is creating the palette. Though there's concrete and brick, but this blends with the color tone of this mud house, and this elements are totally vernacular elements. But also we have discussed how this is having the concept of servant and served. And also if you look at the plan, this has a very organic way of delineating spaces around courtyard, and this courtyard has water court and then green garden court, and to give feelings of a village formation, the way organically it grows. Now examples of Geoffrey Vava's design. His works are very important in a critical regionalism aspect. So this is the Convyloma Hotel, which is set in Sri Lanka. So if you look at the hotel, so this hotel does not disrupt the terrain of this hill at all. So this looks like this hotel is emerged from this terrain, and this stone is it's kind of in a rhythm with the particular hotel. And this hotel's water bodies are also in different stages, and in between this all these natural elements are imbibed in between. And then because of this roof garden on top of this roof and in different levels, and all these creepers around this facade creates the continuity of the natural element through this man-made element. So if you look at the section, so this terrain is not disrupted in the section as well. So these kind of spaces you will see within this terrain. So natural rocks are coming within the spaces. So this is the corridor of this hotel. Through this they will enter in this hotel rooms, and one side you will see this valley of this side. So this side instead of a man-made element, they will see one side this enclosure, and one side of the enclosure there's a natural element, and one side is the man-made element. So this is how this is fusing with the nature. But most of his Geoffrey Vava's work are inspired from a traditional vernacular a house form, which is called Chettinad style of southern part of India in Tamil Nadu. So this Chettinad style of building will have a courtyard, and these are the Chettinad column, and they have a particular style of the southern Indian columns, and these are the elements of design which will be added on the eaves of this of every eaves of this each and every slope, and a particular color tone is used in this this earthen roof tiles, and the main feature is the design features is the courtyard. So these are the designed by Geoffrey Vava, where he is using the courtyard in different form. Sometimes the courtyard is becoming a water body, sometimes this is a blend of stones and different pebbles and other elements, but he is translating this courtyard into the modern different context. Sometimes it's completely water. And then Chettinad style, because this is a vernacular architecture, there are a lot of ornamentations and different elements are there, but in modernist movement this has to be very simple. So this Chettinad column, which was a vernacular and style design, and then a lot of elements are there, are translated into a pure circular column, but the proportion of a Chettinad column is retained in each and every design. So this from circle, this is becoming a cuboidal column, but this is, you can see a clear connection between the Chettinad style column. And these ornamentations in the eaves are changed into the very minimal way of ornamenting the these elements. Because of this battens are coming in the front, you see a little hint of this ornamentation, but which is not exactly an added ornamentation in this his design. And if you look at many other designs of Geoffrey Vauban, you will see how he have taken inspiration from the Chettinad style of design into his building. Thank you.